Some deaths are accidents. This one was a choice, 100 small choices. One step into the trees feels harmless. You tell yourself you will only be gone for a minute. The trail is still right there, until it isn't. The forest doesn't announce the moment you've crossed the line between inconvenience and catastrophe. It simply swallows every landmark, every sound, every sense of direction. Thick spruce and fir erase distance. Familiar ground becomes a maze with no walls and no exits. The wilderness is not cruel because it wants you to suffer. It is indifferent because it doesn't notice you've disappeared at all. Out there, experience is no guarantee, confidence is no compass, and a mistake measured in feet can become a death measured in weeks. These are the warnings they ignored. This is preventable. The hiker who did everything right, until one thing went wrong. Her name was Geraldine Largay. Friends called her Jerry on the trail among strangers who would become something closer to family over 1,000 miles of shared dirt and blisters. She went by a name she had earned one slow, stubborn mile at a time, Inchworm. She was 66 years old, a retired nurse from Tennessee, the kind of woman who had spent an entire career tending to other people's bodies in crisis, and finally decided in retirement to test the limits of her own. Nursing teaches a particular kind of patience, the understanding that healing is rarely fast, that progress is measured in small increments, that the body forgives slowly if it forgives at all. That patience followed her onto the Appalachian Trail. By July of 2013, Inchworm had already logged roughly 1,000 miles of trail, walking north with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone who understood that endurance was never about speed. It was about refusing to stop. She was not out there chasing a photograph. She was not out there for a caption or a story to tell later at a dinner party, or a badge to display online. Jerry Largay was doing what thousands of hikers do every single season on America's most storied footpath, moving forward one white blaze at a time, trusting a century-old system of trail markings that had guided hikers safely through some of the most remote terrain on the eastern seaboard. She had a support system that most solo-through hikers never enjoy. Her husband, George Largay, met her at road crossings along the route with a consistency that bordered on ritual, resupplying her food, checking her condition, tracking her progress the way a man tracks the person he loves most in the world. She carried appropriate backpacking gear for the terrain and the season. She kept a detailed itinerary that she shared with George, so that even when she was alone in the woods, someone always knew, approximately, where she was supposed to be. She had years of hiking experience behind her, and none of the carelessness that so often defines the victims of wilderness tragedies covered on this channel. Jerry Largay was not reckless. She was not unprepared. She was, by nearly every measure that matters out there, doing it right. For Jerry Largay, what should have been another ordinary day on a trail she had already conquered 1,000 times over would become her last. The tragedy did not begin with panic. It did not begin with a storm rolling in off a ridgeline, or a fall down a rocky slope, or a wrong turn onto some unmarked side path chasing a better view. It began with a decision made thousands of times every single season, by thousands of hikers who never think twice about it, who will never think twice about it again after hearing this story. The decision to step a few feet off the trail, a forest that erases people. The stretch of the Appalachian Trail that runs through the western Maine, between the Poplar Ridge Lean-To, the Spalding Mountain Lean-To, and the crossing at Route 27, is not a place that forgives small mistakes. It is remote even by Appalachian Trail standards, a stretch where hikers can walk for hours without encountering another human being, where the nearest road access might be a full day's hike in either direction. The terrain there is dense spruce fir forest, a wall of green so thick it swallows sightlines within seconds of leaving the path. This is not the open hardwood forest of a postcard autumn hike, where sunlight filters down in shafts and a hiker can see 50 yards in any direction. This is close, claustrophobic, coniferous forest, where branches interlock at eye level and the understory chokes every open space with ferns and fallen limbs and years of accumulated deadfall. The ground itself rises and falls unevenly, hiding footing, hiding sightlines, hiding the horizon a hiker might otherwise use to reorient. There is no ridge to walk toward, no river to follow downhill, just trees in every direction, indistinguishable from one another. Search and rescue professionals have spent decades warning hikers about exactly this kind of terrain, and the warning is always some version of the same sentence. Step off an established trail, even for a moment, even for the most mundane and forgivable reason imaginable, and the odds of becoming disoriented rise sharply and immediately. lose sight of the trail for 10 seconds in a Maine spruce forest, and a hiker may have already lost it for good. There is no gradual drift into confusion out there. The transition from certain to lost can happen in the time it takes to turn around. The trees don't part to let a person find their way back. They close behind a hiker like a door swinging shut, silent and total. What makes Gerry Largay's story almost unbearable to sit with is a single detail that would only surface years later, once the search had ended and the questions had mostly gone quiet. When investigators finally located her final campsite, it was approximately 1,500 feet from the Appalachian Trail. Not miles. Not a full day of frantic panic wandering through unfamiliar country. 1,500 feet, roughly the length of 5 football fields laid end to end, a distance a healthy person could cover in a brisk 5-minute walk on open ground. Close enough that on a clear day, in open terrain, a shout might have carried. In that forest, it might as well have been another country entirely. The wilderness never needed Gerry Largay to make a catastrophic mistake. It only needed her to make a common one, the kind made by nearly every hiker who has ever walked a long trail without consequence. The chain that could have been broken. On July 22, 2013, Gerry Largay stepped off the Appalachian Trail. The most likely explanation, based on the evidence recovered afterward, is the simplest and most human one imaginable. She needed privacy and she needed a bathroom. It is a decision made without a second thought by nearly every hiker who has ever spent a day on a long trail. Step a few feet into the trees. Do what needs doing. Step back onto the path and keep walking. It works almost every time because on most trails, in most terrain, the path is never more than a glance away, a familiar shape visible through gaps in the brush. This time, it did not work. Instead of finding her way immediately back to the trail, Gerry Largay became disoriented inside forests so dense that every direction looked identical to every other direction. There was no landmark to orient by, no ridgeline visible through the canopy, no sound of other hikers passing nearby to call out to, just trees and more trees. And the slow, sickening realization that the trail she had been standing on minutes earlier was no longer where she expected it to be. A few steps in one direction felt like they should lead back. They didn't. A correction in another direction felt more promising. It wasn't. Each attempt to fix the mistake only compounded it. She had a cell phone with her. It became almost useless the moment she needed it most. Western Maine's backcountry is notorious among hikers for its near total absence of cellular coverage, and Gerry's phone found nothing to connect to, no matter where she carried it or how she angled it toward open sky. Investigators would later recover evidence that she attempted more than once to send text messages out into that void, including one message that stated plainly and without exaggeration that she had become lost. None of those messages were ever transmitted. They sat trapped inside a device with no signal, words meant to summon help that never once left the phone they were typed into. Somewhere, a husband's phone sat silent, receiving nothing, while his wife typed sentences it would never deliver. This is the point in the story where most retellings of lost hiker tragedies describe a spiral. Panic compounding panic, poor decisions stacking on top of each other until the outcome feels almost inevitable. Gerry Largay's story is different, and that difference is precisely what makes it so devastating to sit with. She did not spiral. She did many of the things a lost hiker is trained, in theory, to do. She stopped wandering, recognizing that continued movement through unfamiliar terrain was more likely to deepen her situation than resolve it. She established a fixed campsite instead of pushing further into unknown ground. She rationed what food and water she had, stretching supplies meant for a single day across a timeline she could not have anticipated. She attempted to signal for help using whatever tools were available to her. She made the calculated decision to remain in one place and wait to be found, a decision that survival experts generally consider correct, because a stationary target is far easier for search teams to locate than a moving one scattering its trail across miles of forest. What she did not have, what could plausibly have changed everything, was a personal locator beacon or satellite communicator, a device no larger than a smartphone, capable of transmitting a precise GPS location to search and rescue coordinators regardless of cellular coverage, regardless of canopy density, regardless of distance from the nearest tower. In terrain where her phone became little more than dead weight in her pack, a beacon would have spoken when nothing else could. It likely would have placed rescuers within yards of her position within days, possibly within hours of activation. Its absence was not a moment of carelessness on Gerry's part. It was simply a gap in preparation that 1,000 successful miles of hiking had never once exposed. The trail had never demanded it of her before, until the one day it did, and by then the demand could no longer be met. By the time Gerry Largay understood that help could no longer hear her, The forest had already hidden her from everyone else who might have. 26 days. Jerry Largay survived in that forest for approximately 26 days. She kept a journal. It was recovered beside her remains, and in its pages she documented pieces of an ordeal that most people will never be forced to comprehend firsthand. The slow, grinding, entirely conscious process of a trained nurse watching her own body run out of everything it needed to keep going and understanding, with clinical precision, exactly what was happening to her. The progression begins with dehydration. Without adequate water intake, blood volume drops, and the body compensates by pulling fluid from tissues that can least afford to lose it. Fatigue sets in first, a heaviness in the limbs that does not lift with rest, a fog settling in behind the eyes that makes even simple tasks feel distant and difficult. Judgment begins to erode before a person even recognizes the erosion happening. Simple decisions that would once have taken seconds begin to take minutes. The ability to problem solve, to think clearly about direction and distance and strategy, deteriorates precisely when it is needed most, in the exact window when clear thinking might still make a difference. Then comes the calorie depletion. With no reliable food source and only what small rations could be gathered or rationed from her pack, the body begins consuming itself of fuel. Muscle tissue breaks down to supply the energy the diet no longer provides. Strength fades, not suddenly, but by degrees, day after day. Movement slows. Every task that once required no thought at all, building a shelter, gathering material to signal for help, simply standing upright long enough to look around, requires more effort than the body has left to give. Cognitive function declines alongside the physical decline. In tandem, each one accelerating the other. Concentration fractures into fragments. Memory grows unreliable. The mind, like the body, begins running on fumes it does not have. Then the exposure sets in. Out in the open, without adequate shelter from the elements, and without adequate calories to fuel her own internal furnace, Jerry Largay's body gradually lost its ability to regulate its own core temperature. Starvation does not simply take away strength. It takes away the body's defenses against the cold, against the damp, against the ordinary temperature swings of a Maine summer night that a well-fed, well-hydrated hiker would barely register as uncomfortable. What should have been survivable became dangerous. What should have been merely dangerous became lethal. 1 degree at a time, 1 night at a time. Through all of it, she stayed close to her campsite. She believed reasonably correctly by every rule of wilderness survival she would have known from her own training and experience that searchers would eventually come. Staying in place was not a failure of judgment. It was, in fact, the decision most likely to save her life under different circumstances, in a search area smaller, or terrain more open, or with a few more days of reserves in the tank. She did nearly everything a trained survivalist would advise. She simply ran out of time before the system built to find her could close the gap between where she was and where anyone thought to look. The medical examiner's conclusion, when her remains were finally recovered more than 2 years later, was as clinical as it was devastating. Death caused by lack of food, lack of water, and environmental exposure. The manner of death was ruled accidental. There was no violence in it, no single dramatic moment of catastrophe to point to. Just days, then weeks of a body quietly running out of options while its owner waited patiently, rationally for a rescue that could not find her in time. While Jerry Largay waited, hundreds of people searched for someone they did not realize was almost within reach. A search that passed within reach. Jerry Largay failed to arrive at her planned rendezvous point with George on July 24th. For a man who had spent weeks meeting his wife at road crossings like clockwork, tracking her progress mile by careful mile, her absence was immediate and alarming. He raised the alarm without delay, and the Maine Warden Service launched what would become one of the most extensive search operations in the state's history. Helicopters swept the ridgelines, scanning for any break in the unbroken green canopy below. K-9 teams worked the ground, noses down, tracing scent trails that dissolved again and again in the density of the spruce forest. Volunteers by the dozens combed the terrain on foot, pushing through undergrowth that scratched and tore at exposed skin, calling her name into a forest that swallowed sound as easily as it swallowed light. A fixed-wing aircraft scanned from above, searching for any flash of color, any pattern that didn't belong among the endless repetition of trees. At its peak, the operation involved more than 100 searchers working the area simultaneously, covering more than 4 square miles of some of the most unforgiving backcountry in New England. Rewards were later offered for information, a quiet acknowledgement of just how thoroughly the case had stalled despite the sheer scale of the effort behind it. And somewhere inside that search radius, Jerry Largay was alive and waiting, and far closer than anyone dared to hope. Investigative records suggest that at one point during the search, teams may have come within roughly 100 yards of her campsite, without ever detecting it. 100 yards, the length of a single football field. In open country, that distance is nothing at all. A shout, a signal fire, a flash of fabric against green would close it in seconds. In that spruce-choked terrain, 100 yards might as well have been 100 miles. The forest that swallowed her whole on July 22nd kept its grip for more than 2 years afterward, indifferent to every helicopter pass, every dog team, every volunteer who walked within earshot of a woman who could no longer call back. It was not a search team that finally found her. It was a forestry contractor working on remote property owned by the United States Navy and used, in a detail almost too bitter to sit with, for wilderness survival training. On October 14, 2015, more than 2 years after Geraldine Largay disappeared, that contractor discovered her final campsite. It sat approximately 1,500 feet from the Appalachian Trail. She'd been walking the day she'd stepped away from it for what should have been a few unremarkable seconds. Her case became one of the most sobering chapters in the modern history of the Appalachian Trail. It reshaped conversations across the hiking community about satellite communicators, about personal locator beacons, about the simple, disciplined practice of maintaining visual contact with the trail before ever stepping away from it, even for something as small and human as a bathroom break. Search and rescue organizations began citing her story explicitly in trainings and public safety briefings, a cautionary tale distilled down from a woman who did almost everything right and who was still lost by a margin measured in feet. Geraldine Largay's story did not expose a failure of the wilderness. It exposed how unforgiving that wilderness becomes once a chain of small, ordinary decisions can no longer be undone. You don't disappear because you intended to. You disappear because each decision feels too small to matter in the moment you're making it. One step off the trail, one assumption that you'll find your way back without even trying hard, one phone that cannot reach a tower no matter how you hold it, one missing beacon that seemed unnecessary right up until the second it wasn't. One forest that never gives you a second chance to get it right. Geraldine Largay was not careless. She was disciplined, and she was deeply loved by a husband who tracked her progress mile by mile and expected, every single time, without fail, to see her again at the next road crossing. She made many of the right decisions after she became lost. She stopped moving, she conserved what little she had, she stayed near her camp, she attempted to signal, she waited with a patience that had defined her entire approach to the trail. But the chain had already begun before any of those good decisions were made. It could have been broken by keeping the trail in sight before stepping away from it, even for a moment. It could have been broken by a satellite beacon small enough to fit inside a jacket pocket, light enough to carry without a second thought. It could have been broken in the first few minutes before distance turned into confusion, and confusion hardened, slowly and irreversibly, into something permanent. Nature never hunted Geraldine Largay. It didn't need to. It simply continued existing, indifferent and unmoved, while she waited to be found by people who came within a football field's length of her and never knew it. In the end, the difference between a woman walking out of that forest and a woman who never did was measured in a few hundred feet of dense Maine spruce, and every step of it was preventable. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It might be the cheapest piece of survival gear you ever pick up. Want more preventable? These stories are next. Thank you for watching.